Hello and welcome to a talk about using postcards to look at where our ancestors may have lived. And for this talk, I want to highlight some of the problems that might arise from using postcards, particularly if you want a view which you want to have some certainty over whether your ancestors would actually have seen the same view. Now, usually I'm researching postcards, looking at who sent or received them. So it's quite fun for me. It's quite a nice change to actually be looking at the other side, to look at the views on cards, which is really the reason why many people buy postcards in the first place in connection with family history research. Now, I've chosen to talk about the mill pond in Swanage as my example for you. Swanage is on the south coast of Dorset. It's a busy seaside town. I grew up there. I lived there for 30 years. And despite how busy the town is, there is an oasis almost of tranquility in the mill pond, which is right in the centre next to the parish church in Swanage. And I think a lot of people would look at the view and consider it to be timeless. But of course, everything changes over time. And so through what I'm going to be sharing with you today, hopefully you'll start to appreciate just how detailed sometimes you need to be in your research if you want to place it with your own family history. So this is a view from the different perspective of the mill pond. And it's a postcard that was sent in 1904. So we know the view dates from before that time. And I want to draw your attention to that gap in the foreground, which I've marked with the red line, and also look at the wall on the left of that foreground as well. Now in 1909, just a few years later, you can see that actually the view has hardly changed, and although we don't have that foreground to see the wall and the gap there, we do get an idea that perhaps this is something which has unchanged. Now, when you look into the distance to the right of that shrub, which is in the centre of that view, you can see in the background Ballard Down, which leads down to Old Harry Rocks and the sea. Today, if you were to stand in this spot, you would barely get a glimpse of the hill because there are buildings and of course there are trees that have grown up as well. So this postcard was sent in 1923, and we can see that that gap between the cottages on the left and the wall on the right is still there. But I want you to look at the buildings that are on the far side of that road. That road is actually Church Hill, and it leads off the High Street in Swanage. Now this view was posted in 1945, but during the Second World War, during the early years of the war, Swanage sustained bombing and there was great loss of buildings and the loss of lives. And the buildings in the area where that red arrow is were lost. And there was much damage actually in the actual area. So when this postcard was sent, the view had changed dramatically, and it had changed several years before this actual date. Now, one thing you might have noticed was that the postcard in 1912 and the one in 1945, the photographer had included the view with the washing line, and it's quite nice to see that all those years later it was still in use. Now, the arrows that point from left to right just want to draw your attention to the chimneys on the mill pond cottages, because you can see that over those passing years they haven't changed that much, although do bear in mind that the 1945 postcard was sent in 1945 and isn't dated as an image of that year. So fast forward on to the 1960s, and that gap between the cottages and the wall is still there. The buildings that were lost during the Second World War have been replaced, and instead of cottages there's a large detached house built in Purbeck stone. The buildings in the foreground of the Mill Pond Cottage as it was, has been redeveloped into several dwellings by this time, and you can see that actually it's been heavily modernised. And although the stone has been recycled and used again, the footprint has slightly changed, and the room layouts and the windows, etc., there has been some dramatic modifications. The arrow on the left is pointing at a shed, really, a large shed, which was actually used by St Mary's Church for small groups to use. It's made of corrugated tin, you can see that from the roof, and it's actually in the land associated with St Mary's. Now, the building that was constructed on the site of those war damaged buildings became eventually the rectory for St Mary's, and it was built in the late 1950s, I believe. So to the 1970s, and we can see still that that building is still there at St Mary's, but also we can make out that the wall has been extended, and so there is now a gate that leads down to that side of the mill pond, and it's private property. So this was completed so that people couldn't walk down that side of the mill pond, although you had free access along the side where you can see those people, and of course behind them you had the cottages, which are still there today, which, although they feed off of Churchill, they are known as being in Churchill. Fast forward on to a very, very recent postcard view of the mill pond, and you can see that the tin structure that was at the front of the church has now been replaced with another Purbeck stone building. And this was actually designed by the rector of St Mary's at this time, and he, before he was ordained, was an architect. So it's quite a lovely connection between the rectory there and the church itself. Now, the postcard on the left has actually been used as a reproduction postcard. The images come from a book, and I wasn't actually able to get a definitive date from this was, but the most striking thing of this postcard is that there is no wall in the foreground. So we know it predates when the earlier postcards in this talk were taken. And if you look at the postcard that's dated 1904 when it was posted, you can see that there have been some changes to those cottages, and I think this is key, that when we regard something as perhaps being timeless, when you look at the details, it isn't so. And this might not actually matter to you in your own family history research, but if your ancestors were in a particular location between specific years, a period perhaps 10 years, you might want to make sure that the postcard you're using is actually a representation of that period. And you can really only do that by further research. This is a great example. Obviously it's not of the mill pond, but it's a great example of how misleading a posted postcard can be for the date. This one was sent in 1907, and the image first appeared around 1890, and it's of the Arms cottages at Selworthy on Exmoor. Now, Mary Eames is standing in the doorway. I've marked her with a red arrow. Now, she actually died in 1901, 6 years before this postcard was sent. So you can see that the postcard was in circulation for more than 20 years, and it continued to be in circulation for a long time. But of course, the further you get away from the period before the First World War, the easier it is to recognise that the image actually is older than perhaps the postal date would suggest. Now, I'm often asked where I buy my postcards. As I've mentioned, I usually research the people who sent or received them, but I normally buy them online. I get them from eBay, and it's a very useful resource for people looking for information about where their ancestors lived. You can set up a saved search of a particular location, and when there's a match, you'll get an email. So you don't have to keep trawling through lists and lists address every day or every week or even every month. If there's a match, they will email you. Now you could do what I do and also add the addresses of where your ancestors lived. Now it could be a long time before you get a match, but you could be lucky. I had a match with an address where my ancestors lived, and they were there in 1901 according to the census, and they were still there in 1911, but the postcard was sent in 1907 to that same address. Now, this person who received the card wasn't a member of my family tree. She was possibly a lodger or a visitor. There was a family with the same name living not far away, and perhaps she was returning to see her family and they couldn't accommodate her for whatever reason. I really don't know. But I love the idea that my ancestors and she knew each other. I love the idea that they may even have handled the postcard. So I had to buy it, even though it didn't really connect with my family history research. So this is something you can do for your own story. Putting in these addresses, putting in family names, that kind of thing can all lead to some remarkable surprises, because we really don't know what's out there, do we? We don't know what happened to our ancestors' ephemera. Much of it got disposed of. That could have meant being on a bonfire, or they could have been passed along and then eventually ended up in the hands of someone that has listed them on eBay, or they're in a box in a second-hand bookshop. There's lots of opportunities to look for these postcards, and it's quite remarkable sometimes what you can discover. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this short talk, and you'll start looking for some postcards in the very near future. Thank you.